My name is Ana Triandafilido. I'm the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration. I'm very happy to chair this session that was actually convened by my colleague, Marcia Akbar, who's a senior fellow with us. Let me first start with the Land Acknowledgement. I'm meeting here today, and our program is based in Toronto, which is the Dish with One Spoon territory. It is the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee, the Mississauga, and the Anishinaabe Indigenous nations. And the Dish with One Spoon territory has a beautiful symbolism because the dish is our nature, our landscape, our natural resources, and we all share in them with one spoon, which means that we all need to take care of them, both at the present time to share them in solidarity and in friendship, but also diachronically, we have a responsibility to look after our natural resources and transmit them to the next generation. I am myself an uninvited guest, a settler to this land. I came to Canada 3 years ago, and I've been, I have to say, I've been grappling to learn fast about truth and reconciliation and how this relates to my own work on migration and immigration. And I have to say, in trying to understand what is my responsibility, I think my responsibility is in trying to find ways to reconcile truly the current, how can I say, situation, the current society and economy in Canada with the claims, the rightful claims of the Indigenous nations, but also acknowledging that the situation has changed compared to when colonialism started and settler colonialism consolidated. And I think we need to together to look forward. And I think this is also a message that has come through to all of us in the last 2 years in relation both to the pandemic and all that we've all been through, and also in relation to Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter, again in the last 2 years. And I think what I'm bringing to this is also my international, how can I say, experience and understanding of certain things, and I'm looking forward to learn from my colleagues. I also want to acknowledge that Ryerson University is in the process of renaming itself. As you know, Egerton Ryerson was the architect of the residential school system. And for those in this virtual room who are not Canadian, the residential school system was a horrible part of settler colonialism that deprived Indigenous children from their families and their culture and their upbringing, and where, how can I say, terrible abuses were committed. And of course, Ryerson had been grappling with its name for 4 or 5 years now, but in the last year, it's become clear that it is untenable to keep our name. And the good news is we're close to finding what the name will be, but it will be, I think the scope will be announced by the end of April by our committee that includes, of course, the Ryerson elder, Joan Dallaire. So stay tuned on that. It's a strange process to work at the university that will then change its name. Anyhow, without further ado, I'm very happy to convene this webinar, because I think the topic is both interesting and important for us researchers looking at the issues of migration and integration, but I think it's also very timely and important for civil society and policymakers. I have a distinguished panel to welcome today. Beyond my colleague, Dr. Marcia Akbar, who is a senior fellow, as I said, of the CERC program and works a lot on these transitions from temporary to long-term, and has done work on both Quebec and Ontario and on different types of temporary workers. I have Associate Professor Amrita Hari from Carlow University. And of course, Amrita and I have only met online, but I look forward to the opportunity to also meet in person, hopefully soon. And Amrita specializes on international students and has done some very interesting work that, again, I think is very policy relevant in terms of the different pathways that the international students can take. And of course, Delphine Nakache, also associate professor at the University of Ottawa. And Delphine, I think, I mean, we've met more times online, but yet, again, not in person, who is also doing some very interesting work on generally the transitions and what have we learned about the lived experiences of people, as well as how can our research speak to policymakers. So, and I have to say that this topic has been of interest to us at the CERC for already the 2.5 years of our program's existence, but I think it has come after the pandemic and the extraordinary measures taken during the pandemic in different directions. It has become particularly timely and relevant for Canada, and I hope that the Canadian discussion can also shed light to international dilemmas, because the situation in Canada is probably similar to Australia, but also to the UK and other countries. Now, I'd like to, as you know, our webinars have an interactive format, so I'll take the liberty to ask one question to each of our speakers, and we will hear their reaction. We start first with Delphine, then Amrita, and then Marcia. After which, as you know, as is customary, you can ask questions in the chat, and I'll be picking up the questions from the chat box. Of course, as you know, at any time, feel free to write your comments and questions in the chat. We will be looking at them. So Delphine, I'd like to ask you a little bit to introduce us to the topic of today, and to tell us a bit more about how the different programs that offering transitions for different groups of temporary migrants play out, and what are their lived experiences.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Anna, thank you very much to the CERC Migration for inviting me to this webinar. I'm very pleased to be here with you today to share my thoughts about this Canadian two-step migration system. So yes, I will start with a brief introduction, really what are the recent developments that have led to the current situation. And I will continue by offering my thoughts on how different degrees of access to transition for different groups of temporary migrants affect their lived experiences, drawing really from field research interviews that I conducted over the last decade with through a variety of projects and in a variety of contexts with migrants and other key informants. But I will really focus today on maybe transition from migrant workers, because Amrita will be talking about international students later on. So the context to start with. So really, immigration to Canada has long been characterized by permanent settlement of immigrants. But over the last 2 decades, this pattern has changed progressively, with temporary economic admissions increasing at a higher rate than permanent economic admissions. And in fact, by the 2010s, for the first time in Canadian history, we had more foreign nationals admitted as temporary workers than as permanent residents. In addition to this increase in temporary economic admission, a second notable trend has been the rise of the so-called two-step immigration programs. So basically, unlike one-step immigration programs, which admit immigrants as permanent residents upon arrival, in Canada, two-step immigration grants access to permanent residents only after a probationary period of temporary employment. And the rise of those two-step immigration programs, such as the Provincial nominee programs or the Canadian Experience Class, has gradually led to a system where over half of permanent residents in the economic class access permanent residence after having worked on temporary visas. This has moved the principle of probationary immigration at the center of Canadian immigration law and policy. So probationary immigration is a term used by Ellerman and Gorogovsia in their 2019 article to refer really to this idea that settlement is becoming a privilege to be earned through a certain behavior. This has also resulted in increased status stratification on the basis of skill and country of origin. Indeed, two-step programs reflect a clear preference for individuals with work experience in skilled occupations, despite the fact that Canada's economy is heavily dependent on the recruitment of migrant workers in low-skilled occupations. So to be clear, with the exception of workers from the SWAP, the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, who do not have, unfortunately, the option to change their status, immigration opportunities exist for workers in low-skilled occupation, but they are much narrower. With the exception, in fact, of very specific programs, those opportunities are not really found at the federal level. They vary greatly across Canada, with some provinces, such as the Prairies, having an appetite to do so via the provincial nominee programs. Thus, immigration opportunities for migrant workers in low-skilled occupations are much more specific and vary greatly across Canada. It is also worth noting that within a same category of temporary migrants, we see a differential treatment on the basis of the country of origin. I give you one example, the International Experience Canada program, which is one of the largest programs under the International Mobility Program. Within that program, it is not so much the skill level of the worker that is really at stake. Rather, the issue lies with the rules of admission and stay that differ greatly according to a participant's country of origin, and that lead to unequal immigration opportunities for participants, since the capacity to transition to a permanent resident status is heavily conditioned by the length of stay on the work permit and the right to renew one's work permit or not. Thus, immigration rules, in fact, have produced hierarchies of statuses that are everywhere now, between and among a same group of temporary migrants, and that result in unequal permanent residence opportunities. This brings me to the last point that I want to make regarding this term that is commonly used, two-step migration or two-step immigration. I believe it is a bit misleading as a term. As discussed earlier, the rise of probationary immigration has gone hand in hand with a sharp rise and increased diversification of temporary migration categories and of new legal hierarchies within these temporary statuses too. So what we see on the ground is in fact increasingly complex trajectories of temporary migrants once admitted in Canada, with several changes in status from one temporary status to the other. This new reality deserves our attention because the transition to permanent residence of most temporary migrants is far from being linear and bidirectional. Thus, what is traditionally called a two-step migration has in fact become, over the years, a multiple-step immigration with far-reaching implications for immigrants and their families. So having set the context, I will move very quickly to the experience of transition, and I will just share with you my thoughts about two, I think, issues currently happening as migrants transition to PR. The first thing that I want to say is that for migrant workers, the transition to PR, permanent residency, is rarely an easy process. Although some participants had fewer challenges with their PR application, almost all describe the process as stressful, worrying, exhausting, and most importantly, believe that the transition was not as easy or is not as easy as it could or should be. So I will focus, as I say in my two-day presentation, on only two types of challenges that I can see as likely, in fact, differently affecting migrant workers' experience as they transition to PR. But before doing so, I also want to highlight that it is essential that all migrant workers be given access to a greater range of settlement services through government-funded organizations in order to ensure that those who are actively pursuing permanent residence have a relatively smooth and safe transition. In the current context, the lack of federally funded services for temporary migrants just does not make sense. So first thing that I wanted to discuss, relying on employer support for permanent residency. Many immigration programs for migrant workers are employer-driven. Either a job offer from a Canadian employer or full-time paid work experience in Canada with the same employer is a precondition for transitioning from temporary to permanent resident status. Relying on employer support for permanent residence is highly problematic for a smooth transition to permanent residence. Employer-driven immigration processes rely heavily on chance. That is on the hope that migrant workers will have an employer who will not take advantage of employees by using the carrot and stick approach to PR. For instance, we frequently met workers who remained in difficult or even exploitative conditions for the sake of securing permanent residency. Workers should be in a position to self-nominate for permanent residence, as easy as that, by simply demonstrating their work experience as accumulated in Canada with pay stubs or other employment records. Of course, this goes hand in hand with the necessity to seriously revise the current scheme, which is the employer-specific or tied work permits. Canadian research has already established the clear connection between precarious legal status of workers on an employer-tied work permit and their exploitative living and working conditions. So I will not be talking about that. But I just want to highlight that this is happening not only within the temporary foreign worker program, the TFWP, that has been the subject of most intention. We in fact see an increasing proportion of workers within the international mobility program, the IMP, work in low-skilled occupations and with an employer-specific permit. In fact, the number of workers with an employer-tied work permit is now reaching 1/3 of all international mobility program participants. And so the concerns that we had before continue today. So if the government's objective is to satisfy the labor needs of important industries or regions, then migrant workers could be given sector, regional work permits as an alternative. So this is the first point that I wanted to make. And the second point, maybe, that I wanted to address today before leaving the floor to my colleagues is really prolonged family separation. Most workers in low-skilled occupations are not permitted to bring their families, spouse and children to Canada. There is a complex landscape here, and I can explain it later on if you want, but basically they don't come with their family, and they come to work in Canada for several years. So in contrast, workers in higher skilled occupation can bring their family. They can obtain an open work permit for their spouse or common law partner. That is a work permit that enables them to work for any employer. Several of our migrant worker participants with jobs in low-skilled occupations who had no choice but to leave their families at home when coming to work in Canada describes the many hardships involved in maintaining relationships with their spouses and children. Supporting and facilitating family units brings immense benefits to both the Canadian state and migrant workers and their families. So there is really no justification for limiting the right to family accompaniment to one group of workers. Spouses and partners of workers of all skills levels should be entitled to open work permits. Not all workers would necessarily bring their family immediately upon arrival, but the choice to do so is integral to a smooth transition to permanent residency. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I will give the floor to my dear colleague Amrita.
Thank you. Thank you, Delphine. Yeah, you provided us for a very interesting overview. I really like the term probationary migration. And certainly, I think you highlighted some of the contradictions of the system that has not necessarily, how can I say, developed as planned or has led to adjustments, and I think you've already pointed out to how complex the system is. But I'd like you to ask Amrita to tell us a bit more about the transition challenges faced by international students in Canada. And we know there's been some new policy thinking and that you have been looking into that.
Thank you, Anna. Again, thank you for the invitation, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Delphine. I just admire your work all the time, and it's such a lovely introduction to the remarks I'm going to make about international students. So I'll jump right into it. So I will say that the responses that I have to your questions, Anna, and also posed by Marcia, have the study that is informing it has been done in collaboration with Dr. Chen Wang, who just finished her PhD at the University of Ottawa. And I'm excited to say that it is forthcoming in international migration. So we're very excited to finally have it published in some format. So I'll get to it, I mean, international students are a very interesting category, and they always have been an interesting category, yet still fairly under research, at least various aspects of international students remains under research. I think the recruitment of international students has now gone beyond the previously very derogatory depiction of them as cash cows. I think that for the most part, recruiting international students has become a part of the national strategy for migration in a lot of countries, and Canada, of course, is no different. Canada's international student population has grown exponentially over the last decade, and obviously we're seeing it not just in universities, but specifically in colleges, right? And that relates quite a bit to the pathways available to them. The assumption is that they're primed to gain permanent residence because they have the qualifications, local language skills, Canada-specific knowledge that would make them a perfect fit for Canadian industries and workplaces. So they'd be able to circumvent some of the barriers that we know for a long time has kind of created and contributed to the skilled labor market disadvantage that's so well documented. And as Delphine already said, a notable shift in the policy landscape has been this growing reliance on employers to identify and facilitate immigration candidates' transition, right? And so this is, and Delphine, you've done a beautiful job of kind of highlighting the problems of it. So a lot of the participant experiences that I'll mention actually support a lot of what you've said. And we found that when we actually did speak with international students themselves. And that this employer reliance is in both federal programs, so whether it's the Canadian Experience class, but also at the provincial level. So even though the two pathways can be complementary, they don't actually fix any of the problems of each other. If anything, they kind of compound it. And that's kind of important to remember as we talk about the ways in which international students kind of negotiate the different trajectories. And so this employer-driven selection obviously emphasizes the notion of prearranged employment, which, as Delphine has said, we've noted for a long time the issues with that, and any form of like employer-tied, work permits and the issues with that already. So we spoke with 17 Chinese women international students who wish to remain in Canada after completing their degrees. And we talked to them specifically about their motivation to stay, but also their transition strategies, right? So how they make use of this supposed two-step program, which Delphine, as you importantly note, is not two-step, it's multi-step and incredibly complex. And so the study participants resided in Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia, which is why our focus on the provincial programs is actually the Alberta provincial program and the Ontario specifically, because only one of the participants was from BC, and we didn't feel like there was enough richness for us to really explore the program itself. And as I said, the analytical lens we took was looking at transition strategies by comparing federal and provincial, so a very specific lens into their experience. To address the first question, and I think that Marcia, you'll talk about this a little bit too as you talk about specific initiatives, there has been a general recognition and I think a move away from kind of depicting international students as this homogenous and relatively privileged category when it comes to skilled permanence, right? And I think the pandemic has really revealed, as you mentioned, Anna, the vulnerabilities of international students. And so there is this sense that this transitory stage of their migration exposes them to economic, legal, and personal dimensions of precarity. So this idea of extending, I think, precarity and temporariness as a lens to understand international students is, I think, gaining wider recognition and kind of separating from the homogenous construction of the privileged, high-skilled category. So we are starting to see that shift. So federally, the Canadian Experience class is highly popular among international students, of course, but those that have qualifying work experience can also apply under the Federal Skilled Worker Program as well. Though I'll explain, not as they don't have as much as an advantage in the FSWP as they would, I think, with VEC. And now both streams are managed under the Express Entry system, right? So that's a big part of their experiences as well. So in our discussions with our participants, we found that their access to immigration pathways and chances of success, unsurprisingly so, is directly related to their ability to gain support from a Canadian employer, right? And that's a big thing to remember, especially in light of what Delphine's already talked about the problems that can arise with that kind of reliance, right? And that kind of a tied program. And so it wasn't surprising, of course, that international students face significant hardships to secure employment. They endure substantial financial, emotional, and social costs in order to succeed, right, in the Canadian labor market and in the Canadian immigration regime. So under express entry, of course, having a job offer is an important qualifying condition that's been sort of further entrenched through the changes to the comprehensive ranking system that like many of my colleagues have noted. So international students that do not or cannot have prearranged employment have a really hard time just relying on their education in Canada, right? So that doesn't become sort of enough anymore. So in terms of the provincial immigration programs, as I mentioned, we limited it to the AINP, the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, and the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program. We found that both provinces undoubtedly required candidates to have a full-time job offer or some form of employment contract from employers based in the province. And as a result, participants took up jobs in retail sectors, especially retail and other service industries, which were numerous, they were easily accessible, and most importantly, as one of our participants, Wei, put it so well, are highly skilled positions that are recognized by local immigration authorities. And that was really the driving force in terms of finding employment. So what it also meant that international students felt compelled to accept underemployment and de-skilling as a necessary strategy to immigrate. And so what another consequence, of course, and Delphine, you mentioned this a little bit, is employer exploitation, right? So some participants certainly reported encountering threats from employers to withhold their support for immigration applications. They felt immense pressure to be model employees. And so there was hesitation to ask for any kind of provisions, promotions, accommodations, or pay increases because they felt it would risk losing the opportunity to immigrate, right? So a lot of the documentary evidence that you're talking about as well, and I'm sure, Delphine, you found in your participants. But a key feature that set apart the Ontario program was the human capital category, which wasn't available in the Alberta program. So immigration candidates in Ontario that took advantage of this program could be eligible with lower ranking scores. And they also reported a bit more flexibility in terms of waiting to find the right job, or having a little bit more latitude in kind of doing that. The only kind of caveat was that once the application portal becomes available, it fills up very quickly. And so there has been a recent change that allows for a new expression of interest system, but we're yet to see how that actually works out. So going as quickly as possible, we've made three important observations, I think, in terms of the experiences that we noticed. So we realized that most participants actually apply through provincial programs as opposed to federal ones. Sometimes they would apply to multiple programs to see support, but in our group, we found that they found more success with provincial pathways because they had a bit more flexibility. They had more pliable job requirements, often lower CRS scores, and shorter durations of Canadian experience that needed to be demonstrated. But they did have more complex procedures and higher fees, but I think the cost benefit analysis that most participants kind of went through kind of allowed provincial pathways to be a better option. We also found that they obviously face an extended labor market disadvantage because in the transition process, if you're taking up part-time job opportunities, work outside of the intended field, and of course, the ever-present Canadian first hiring agenda, this obviously has an impact when they start to kind of recreate their careers or professional lives even after immigrating, right? So this idea that there's this direct switch as soon as transition is made, we found to be a falsity in most of their experiences. And of course, as we've mentioned, the disproportionate reliance on private actors, especially employers, exposes them to career delays, de-skilling, and exploitation. So in response to the second question, and I think this will link with some of Marcia's and Delphine's work as well, is there obviously needs to be a revisit of this balancing of the human capital measures versus employer reliance, right? And what that revisit looks like, I think Delphine and Marcia, you'll have very specific ideas about that. But I think that the the success in some ways, or at least the Ontario, the human capital stream of the Ontario program kind of tells you that there are ways to work around some of the restrictive measures. Second and related, there needs to be a loosening of a lot of the federal restrictions. And I think the federal pathways can learn from the provinces that have actually found success in retaining a lot of these international students by having a bit more flexibility in their programs. And third and finally, Delphine, you mentioned this, and I keep reiterating this as well, is there just needs to be more flexibility and variability in pathways to immigration, right? There needs to be recognition for the fact that these are really complex, and that having numerous and flexible pathways actually redistributes the power that a lot of private actors hold in the process. It thereby should reduce exploitation, and it enables international students to find more commensurate employment, right? It gives them the time to actually do that. And I think overall, we all know the benefits of having an easier transition and more pathways to help you establish yourself, because it increases sense of belonging, recognition, and acceptance, which I hope is the general goal that we want with a system of immigration. So I'll stop there, and I apologize for going over time and hand it over back to you, Anna.
Thank you, and no problem for going a few minutes over time. Yes, quite a few. I think it's very interesting also, comparing the different pathways and the lived experience as well. But without further ado, I'd like to ask Marcia my question, which I think ties in very well with what you just presented, Amrita. So Marcia, what are the implications of the recent policy initiatives that are facilitating actually the transition of some temporary workers to permanent residency status? And I see that the chat is already very active on that front, but let us first hear your reflection.
Thank you, Anna, for asking this important and timely question. So Canadian government has taken a number of policy initiatives during the pandemic to address the challenges that different groups of temporary migrant workers and international students face. And Amrita and Delphine already kind of discussed some of those challenges. So I'm going to highlight 3 policy initiatives that are connected to the transition of international students. So first, in January 2021, the government extended the postgraduate work permit program for 18 months. So it means that students can extend their permit for 1.5 years. And also a recent CIC report mentioned that they can further extend the permit if they continue to work in Canada. So in the past, students used to get this permit once for 1 to 3 years based on their length of study. So this is an initiative to facilitate students so that they can work in Canada, continue to work in Canada, and gain employment experience so that they can apply for Canadian Experience class, as well as some of the provincial nominee programs to get permanent residency. So the second initiative was taken in the same time in January 2021. So IRCC, Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, invited a record number of Canadian Experience class applicants to apply for permanent residency. They literally accepted everyone who applied during that time. So the number is 27,332, and the lowest score was 75. Usually the lowest score, the CRS score is 413. So you can guess that everybody with a different level of language proficiency and work experience got a chance to get permanent residency, which is good for many international students who were struggling to get permanent residency. They had an opportunity to get it. And finally, in April 2021, the government announced a special program to provide permanent residency to 90,000 international graduates and essential workers. So 40,000 spots were allocated for international graduates. That means when international students graduate from their study, they finish their study, they'll be able to apply for permanent residency without any work experience. That again kind of benefited some of the students who graduated during this period, and they are able to apply for permanent residency without any work experience. So the question is, what are the implications of these policy initiatives? So currently we don't have enough data and information to evaluate that, but we clearly see that these initiatives are not addressing some of the core issues or long-standing issues that international students are facing, and already Delphine and Amrita already has pointed out those issues. For example, provision to settlement services. So in Canada, international students get limited services, support and services from the educational institutions, universities, and colleges, although we don't know much about what kind of services the colleges provide. And then from a few community-based organizations. And also there are a few provincial programs, for example, International Student Connect program, through which some international students get services. But there isn't any well-organized, federally funded service provision for international students in Canada. We have to remember that there are 600,000 international students in Canada, about 600,000, and about 100,000 postgraduate work permit holders. So about 700,000 of them do not have any federally funded support program. So many current reports published by CBIE, Canadian Bureau for International Education, and BMRC, Building Migrant Resilience in Canada, as well as several qualitative studies already identified that international students and graduates need support and services to deal with labor market challenges, immigration process, mental health issues, and social and cultural adaptation. Recently, a Toronto Star report, like several reports are published in Toronto Star by Nicholas Keung. In these reports, international students also identified that labor market challenge is one of the biggest challenges that they face. But we see that there isn't any specific service or support program for them. We need to also recognize that even though we are talking about a two-step immigration process, many international students actually go through a three-step process. They go from study permit to postgraduate work permit, and then postgraduate work permit to permanent residency. And because this is a lengthy process and time-consuming process, they need more support and services from the government. They can access those supports through social media or by themselves. That would be a new liberal lens to see their support system. So the main objective, the Canadian government's main objective, to bring increasing number of international students with the assumption that they will be the perfect, ideal, skilled citizens in the future, as Amrita emphasized. But that is not happening because a recent study by Leah Vosco actually discussed how in Canada, there's a new class of precarious employers are emerging who are international students. So they're creating a new class of precarious workers. Feng Ho and his colleagues also showed that international graduate students are much less than Canadian-born graduates. So all indicators show that there is a gap between what the policy objectives and what are actually happening in reality. So international students are telling us what they need. Are we listening to them? Like the policy makers, are they listening to them? And another point I want to expand on is the diversity among international students that Amrita already mentioned. So we have that homogeneous understanding of international students are most probably young and single and will, graduate and ready to participate in the labor market. But we know in Canada, international students are studying in colleges and universities at different levels, undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, even postdoctoral level. And then they are pretty much diverse in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. And their demographic characteristics are also pretty diverse in terms of family composition and age. So their challenges and needs are also diverse, and we don't have enough data and information to understand what kind of challenges each group actually face. So I would say that these policy initiatives, of course, benefited some international students to get permanent residency, but it's not addressing the root causes that are creating all these challenges and mental health issues and low labor market outcomes of international students. So I can actually talk hours on international students. So for the interest of time, I'm going to just emphasize a few points about essential workers. So as Delphine mentioned, that among essential workers, agricultural workers are the most marginalized group in terms of transition. Both seasonal agricultural workers and non-seasonal agricultural workers, I would argue. And so in May 2020, the government actually introduced a program, agro pilot program, to provide permanent residency to non-seasonal agricultural workers. It's a very small program for 2,750 people. And then just mention about the 90,000 international graduates and essential workers program. So among those 50,000 spots are allocated for essential workers, 30,000 actually for non-health workers. So I have doubt to what extent actually agricultural workers got the opportunity to take that opportunity, they were able to apply for permanent residency, as they didn't have any opportunity before. So they needed a lot of help and information even to fill in the forms. We'll know that when we'll get the data. But again, I would like to emphasize that this is not, again, addressing the long-standing issue that they don't have any designated pathway to get permanent residency. So in conclusion, I would say that these policy initiatives obviously were taken with good intentions and obviously benefited some temporary workers and international students, especially during the pandemic. However, they are offering a kind of a band-aid to cover up a wound instead of preventing the wound from happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Yes, certainly. I mean, that initiative, I think, was welcome, also given the pandemic. But as you say, not everybody was able to benefit in the same way. I could have, yes, some questions myself, but I think the chat, I'd like to start by taking some questions from the chat, and I'll take the liberty to address them to specific speakers so that we can keep things moving. So we have a first question by John Carline. I'd like to address it to Delphine, where John is asking, we're all aware of the civil society mobilization for status, and whether you think that requests like that of the Migrant Rights Network for Status for All is a good idea. And I'll probably add to that, I think we can consider whether it is a good idea in terms of our own perspective or if you want a normative perspective, but also is it a good idea strategically? So to ask for status for all. Delphine, what do you think?
I see where this initiative comes from, because obviously of the very limited pathways, and the kind of issues that we are experiencing currently. I'm a bit divided on the question. I think two things, two parts of the answer. The first one is that I don't think everyone would like necessarily to stay in Canada permanently if there was a better opportunity to leave the country and to come back, and so if the mobility was better organized. So for me, this is a much broader question, because this is also how we consider temporary migrants. So once again, if temporary migrants could come with their family for 1 year, 2 years, and then leave to come back to their country, and then after 1 year come, or how they would like to organize their own mobility if they had the means to do that in a way that is respectful of their family, that would give them really the opportunity to move without all the troubles that we know are linked to visa procedures and so on and so forth. And Anna, you have worked a lot on that, right? The control of migration. If this was better organized, I think maybe that would not be necessarily needed for everyone, because they would have the opportunity to do the back and forth and to really do something that works well with their own plans. That being said, what I think is that when people are invited in a country to work, and there is the opportunity, a clear opportunity that they know for them to stay on a longer term, because we want them on a longer term, and they have proven that they have done what they have met the expectation, we should make things much more simpler. 1 year of full-time work employment in any category. You want to apply for PR, you apply for PR, and you get it. It should be as easy as that. So I think the criteria should be the same for everyone. This would be my response, but I'm not sure giving everyone permanent residence upon arrival, right after arrival, is necessarily needed in a context where some people, if they had the opportunity to organize their mobility better, might be maybe interested in an in-between solution. But certainly you work, you have accumulated enough years of work experience, you should be given that path to PR, even if you work in a skilled position. I think the problem right now is that, the path is mostly for highly skilled, and this is unfair. And as I discussed, this is not only for the skilled, this is also based on many other things. So, but I see where it comes from, because there is right now no other plan actually that is on the table.
Well, thank you, Delphine. Yeah, actually that ties well into another question by Emilio Rodriguez, who asks, or comments that in the recent, federal budget announcement, there is a requirement or an encouragement to select applicants that match Canada's changing and diverse economic labor force needs. So it leaves it quite open. It doesn't say necessarily the highly skilled or the best and brightest, etc. And we have also a question by Morgan Arabari-Zawoko, who asks about particularly the fate of health professionals who were rushed into the country with 1-year permits, and what will happen there. So I'd like to address these two reflections or questions to Marcia specifically. So in terms of, how do we see these measures that you just analyzed in juxtaposition with rushing in the door people, particularly in the health and care sector, and second, whether we see this special measure of the 90,000, so to speak, in relation to Canada's diverse, labor market needs.
Thank you for the question. So I think to begin with that the policy initiatives, for example, the program, the 90,000, giving 90,000 people the PR, is actually taken to fulfill the immigration target to begin with. So that's because of the pandemic, there was a backlog in terms of the arrival of the permanent residents. So, and there was a target to fill like 400,000 immigrants, and Canada need people to, as you know, due to the negative birth rate and shortage of labor. So it was taken for that. It's not like, just to fulfill that goal first, not necessarily to, as I think, to do any favor to anyone. In terms of, to be honest, the temporary migration program with its all groups, categories and categories is so complex. It seems so complex to me. And because of the degree of rights and rules and regulations are so complex that sometimes it feels kind of bizarre for me to make sense that why we are seeing one group who is for example, you mentioned health workers, right? Different rules and regulations for health workers. And also it's great that the rules and regulations related to health workers actually evolved over time from 1980s to 90s, and now that they have much more flexible rules, so they can come and get permanent residency. They don't have to live with their employers and so on. On the other hand, the seasonal agricultural workers, they are totally dependent on their employers in terms of almost everything, even for their health care, even though they have provincial health card, provincial health card, and they can access individually healthcare, but still they're scared often to even report their health issues. So these are quite opposite or contrasting examples that we are having. And in between there are international students that we have already discussed so much about them. So just to say that I think whether the government is responding to the immediate labor market needs or needs of the employers rather than actually needs of the migrants. So the main focus is to how to fulfill labor shortage and how to actually respond to the demands of the employers. And with that, I want to add that how the two-step immigration process has actually changed that landscape, having employers more power in terms of selecting migrants and deciding who can come and who can transition. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marcia. I'd like to turn to Amrita because I was very interested, and I take my prerogative as chair to ask this question, because you explained this kind of trade-off between going for Canadian experience, but then you have to have a job in your profession, in what you studied or what is your profession, versus going for the provincial program, where, if I understand it correctly, there's no prerogative, it can be any job offer. So I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit more on that, because you suggested that from your research, people tend to prefer the PNP because, as we know, probably any job is much easier to have than a job in a specific profession. But also, how does this, again, is juxtaposed to what Emilio was suggesting, that in the budget we speak about, changing and diverse labor market needs, but at the same time, we know the narrative and actually the policy is only highly skilled people. That's what Canada needs today and going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think Chen is very familiar with the intricacies of the program much more than I am. So I'm really missing her right now. But I think this question, I don't think it's that the provincial pathways, it's not a free-for-all in the same kind of way, but I think the thing that participants mostly talked about was actually the CRS was a big factor, and the ways in which there was a lot more flexibility with the comprehensive ranking system than there was with the federal pathways. So with the federal pathways, they often were at a disadvantage because people accessing those programs would have more actually diverse work experience coming in, but also in Canada, and would have benefited from having a longer trajectory in the labor market than international students would have. So they benefited from the pliability of the way work experience was exercised, I think, in the provincial programs. But a big factor was really that provincial programs often had lower CRS marks. And that was a thing that I think international students really struggled with in federal pathways, was making that CRS threshold that they found easier to achieve. And in some ways, I think that that was a big factor, and that they could, find an employer, even if it was not exactly, again, meeting those ambiguous needs of Canada's diverse needs, was a bit more pliable in the provincial systems, even though it was often more expensive actually for the applicants. But one of the things that would always come through was the challenge of meeting that CRS threshold, and then how important then that made that support letter from the employer, right? Like because of how much weight that carried. So that each of those negotiations were interconnected. And as Marcia sort of emphasized already, that none of those were to the benefit of the person applying. They were all either working to the benefit of the employer or whatever Canada deems is their preferred or idealized worker, right? So it was, I don't know if it responds directly to what you're asking, Anna, but it was mostly around that there was just a bit more flexibility, but it was in no way kind of free-for-all or systematic in the way Delphine is suggesting that we go for, right? So unfortunately, I think it's the ambiguity of the requirements that just works to the disadvantage of the applicants every time, right? So Delphine's like very careful response to this idea of like, how can we create a uniform system that kind of recognizes the rights of the applicant as much as the needs of the programs or, like labor shortage needs. That I think that ambiguity of that balance is what makes it so much harder, I think, for the applicants, which is why they prefer the provincial, because at least they know they can meet that threshold more easily. I wouldn't say very easily, but more easily. Is that what the thing you were nodding, is that something you saw in the folks you spoke to, and Marcia as well?
I have one more question, but Marcia, I understand you want to make a short comment on Rita's comment?
I just wanted to add that I was checking the PNP requirements for Manitoba for international students yesterday, and I saw that they have to finish 6 months of employment before applying. Just wanted to add it. So for CAC, you have to have 1 year of employment experience to become qualified, to become eligible to apply for permanent residency. But the PNP program, particularly in Manitoba, actually allows students to apply after 6 months of employment when their employer obviously suggests, confirms that the employment will be continued, of course, but still it gives them a little bit more flexibility in terms of applying.
Yeah, we don't have, certainly it's a complicated set of questions, but I'd like to, because I'm also aware of the time, I'd like to highlight, I think, a few important things that were mentioned today. So I think one thing that Delphine pointed out, and I know, is that we're looking at the system from the policy perspective. We probably forget the lived experience. Why does the transition have to be kind of traumatic? Why does it have to be so hard? Particularly the right to family life, which is, I think, also basic human rights. So why are some categories not allowed to bring their families? Although we know not everyone will bring their families, but why not allowing them? And I think you were looking into the very complex, and I think that's something also, our colleagues in the federal government recognize that the system right now is very complex, and sometimes one is lost in the legal categories and in the multiple steps. It's not really a 2-step, but Marcia also said that it's a 3-step and even multiple step migration in between work and study. I think Delphine was saying that the role of employers is a bad thing, but I want to raise this question. That will be my final question when I finish this short kind of bringing things together. The role of employers is a bad thing, but I'm afraid that the role of employers is necessary. And we have seen that also people who come as PR suffer from this fact that if they haven't had contacts with an employer previously, that's one reason why they face hardship, because they don't know where to start from. I think that also, then these dilemmas were also highlighted by Rita, who actually explained how the two trajectories of being, a worker and being a student are very much intertwined, and how students, I think that is also important to remember, that migrants actively, how can I say, interact with the policies and try to see which category fits best their plan. Again, without this meaning that everyone wants to stay, but if they want to stay, and what does the threshold require with this high skilled requirement or a job in your profession. And then of course Marcia was very very, I can say, a little bit not cynical on your part, cynical on the part of the government, to say the 90,000 was not to make the life easier for anyone, but it was to meet the target of the 401,000 permanent residents accepted in 2021, which, as many of you know, but for those who are not so familiar with Canada, Canada did admit 401,000 permanent residents in 2021, most of which, however, were physically in the country. So they transitioned to permanent status. And I think you highlighted, Marcia, how this particular pathways required also some high-level familiarity and access to your documents, to a computer, to knowing the system. And perhaps not always supports were in place for those who were not familiar. And I think Ashika Nirala was also writing in the chat that we know the international student pathway within the 90,000, fields, like within 24 to 48 hours or so. But the agriculture and the care workers pathway within the 90,000 took much longer. I want in this, I think it is very interesting. There's there's several very interesting comments in the chat, but Lisa Brunner was pointing out that those international students who work during their studies, and presumably they work in non-qualified jobs, or like kind of any part-time job they can find, do better during the postgraduate work permit period. And I assume, Lisa, you when you say you mean successful, you mean they're successful in finding a qualified job and then potentially transitioning to permanent residency, which I think speaks to me to the fact that they develop their networks. So if I'm an international student and I work anywhere, like in a shop or something, or in a restaurant, I still get familiar with the place, expand my networks, and maybe improve my language skills, my communication skills, and then when I graduate, I am better placed in the labor market, which again then brings me back to my initial question. So I think having the employers as part of the scheme going forward will be necessary. So what will, if you can briefly, like in half a minute, because I also know you have to go to other meetings, what would be your preferred, what you think would be a good role for the employers in the system? And on this, very briefly, I also want to acknowledge Phil Lovelace, who was asking earlier, have we learned anything from the guest worker schemes in Europe in the past? And also another colleague, I think, was mentioning, yes, we've been there before, so there's nothing so much new. So I think I'll start with Marcia and go then to Amrita and then to Delphine. So what would be the preferred role for the employers in your view?
Okay. So I would say that the roles of the employers can be pretty positive and negative at the same time. It depends on what kind of migrants we are dealing with. So we know that the so-called high-skilled temporary workers who come under the STEM, like, the IT, science and technology engineering sector, they don't suffer as much as the low-wage, low-skill sector. So although there are debates on that too, because we see more and more that kind of high-skilled workers from Global South, which creates the social condition or context for also them to become vulnerable and exploited by the employers due to the race relations and racialization in the labor market. So, but still they might get the benefits of coming to Canada with a job and then use that experience to get further job to succeed in the labor market. But if we think about the vulnerable groups, for example, the agricultural workers or low-skilled workers, or even international students we think that they're like future skilled migrants, but as long as they're students, they're quite vulnerable. The employers are more likely to abuse them and exploit them. And this is kind of a social condition of our relations based on that.
No,
gender
certainly,
based.
yeah. It is clear that the employers have a certain power, even for highly skilled jobs.
Yes.
Yeah, and definitely, I think it's important that you highlight they have differential power depending on which job you're like. But maybe, I don't know, also Amrita and Delphine can give us, like, what would you propose as a role for the employers in the scheme going forward?
I mean, in our study, a lot of the folks that did actually have letters of support from employers were employers they worked for part-time, right? So there was this sort of transitioning to a full-time employment contract within the jobs they were already in. So Anna, kind of what you're saying in that, you know, this demonstrates they were able to build their networks and all of that. But I echo Marcia's concerns about, you know, what that means in terms of their reliance on, you know, this one employer. And, you know, when we say employer, these are often like, you know, managers at like a particular franchise, or, you know, like, you know, folks that hold a lot of power over these employees, right? And especially when it's not just power over that specific job, but essentially their migrant future. So I think there needs to be some mechanisms in place. And I can think, I mean, these parallel conversations we've had before about even seasonal agricultural workers, right? Like, it's the lack of mechanisms in place to monitor adherence to labor contracts that just kind of falls through the loophole when it comes to migrants, right? Like, there's just not a lot of recourse when there is a breach of contract or there is an abuse of employers. And in this case, the lack of recourse, as I said, it's not just for that job, it's basically their future in the country. So I think that, you know, do I agree with the benefits of, you know, having kind of employer support? Yes. But I think what I take issue with the employer tied nature of it, right? It's the reliance. I think that, as Marcia has also said, like, employers can play a more positive role if we can redistribute the power in some ways, right? If we can have either mechanisms in place that redistribute the power, as Marcia said, if we can have sort of federal services in place that can help workers understand their contract and their rights, and, you know, have mechanisms for appeals. And if we can actually think about this, and this is something Delphine has been arguing for a long time, as with others, is if we can think about rather than employer type, like sectoral, right? And have a bit more flexibility and variability, you know, whether it's temporal, like whether it's the time condition, or the sectoral kind of flexibility, right? In terms of what we identify as sort of like eligible work, right? Because a big part of it is, if you think about migrant workers are the most subject to that kind of know yourself or you're screwed, then, you know, then others are, right? And it's a, you know, it's a function of the privilege of citizenship that we don't expect them to have a life plan when it comes to, you know, your Canadian citizens, but when it comes to migrants, it has real impacts if they don't, and if they don't play the market. And I think that goes back to these questions about how can we make the system more just, right? But I'll stop there and jump in.
It is important what you say, that in this case, like, probably we all depend on our employers in different ways, but in this case, it's not just your job, it's your future in the specific country. Delphine, you have the final word, and I'm conscious that we're running out of time.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think we have to be aware of the broader picture here. And what is the broader picture is that the path from temporary to permanent residence is not, I mean, it's better assumed than a few years ago, I mean, politically assumed, but we are not quite there yet. And so we have to see this question of power within a context where migrant workers do not have access to any kind of services, right? Legal services, etc., etc. Migrant workers are experiencing issues meeting some of the language requirements. And I know that there were questions about language. This is key. So we are in a context where, in a very particular context where employers are left with lots of power, and sometimes, even if they are not necessarily employers that want to be not nice with their employees. They just don't know how to proceed. And, you know, they are lost themselves because this is a very complicated system. So I completely agree with Amrita and Marcia that the problem is the weight, the power that they have right now, which is completely, you know, unequal and which is actually giving them too much power. And the good employers that we interviewed, because we, you know, they told us that they were worried about having to do everything, you know, in terms of, they feel themselves that it was too much in their hands. And there are good initiatives. For example, and not just to answer your question, I've seen cases where employers worked with the cities. For example, the Maple case, some time ago, we worked with, we interviewed them and we interviewed their workers. Maple Leaf in Brandon, Manitoba, you know, there are language courses inside inside the processing inside the business, so they can help, they can contribute, they can help, but the power that they have right now in a context where migrant workers are left, or international students really are left to themselves, is really problematic, because we assume that they have to do everything, and it's not up to them to do so. So I will stop here. And there are different ways they can advise, you know, and say, here are the needs. And but the extreme reliance on employers is, for me, you know, the problem when migrant workers do not have the proper services and help coming from, you know, the government.
Thank you very much, and thank you all, and thank you to those from the chat, because I think we have many interesting ideas and suggestions in the chat. I think we do have a concluding set of remarks, which is, well, first of all, to point to the lived experiences, the many you know, hurdles people go through, to point to the idea that closed permits, and it was written in the chat by a few people, closed employer permits are not good, but maybe one could think of regional permits, or, you know, sector specific permits. And I think what I'm getting from you, and I totally agree, is also the need for access to support and services, also for the temporary migrant workers or the international students who want to transition, is very important, as it would. So this set of things, of supports, of measures, would allow for a better matching between the offer and the demand, but at the same time without making the worker highly vulnerable and highly exploitable. And I also hear the comment of Marcia that this may play out differently for people who are racialized and non-racialized, and that we need to take into account too. So thank you all for staying with us, for going over time. And as you know, the recording will be shortly available, and everyone will receive it. My colleagues seem to, who I'd like to thank for, you know, being our host today. She's hiding behind the CERC Migration little box. And see you at our next webinar. Thanks to all.